Tonight, we examine a case that once commanded national attention and then passed unresolved into the historical record. A single journey, a single carriage, and a question that no inquiry was ever able to answer. The case of Mary Sophia Money begins in southwest London in the autumn of the year 1905. It was the 4th year of the reign of King Edward VII, and the district in which Mary Money lived and worked was one of the busy, respectable, lower middle-class quarters that had grown up along the railway lines running out of the capital toward the county of Surrey. London, in 1905, was the largest city in the world, a metropolis of more than 6 million people, expanding outward year upon year along the tracks that carried clerks and shopkeepers and dairymen between their homes and their places of business. The railway was not in that year a novelty. It was the ordinary machinery of daily life, and a young woman travelling alone upon it in the evening drew no particular remark. The neighbourhood of Lavender Hill, where Mary Money was employed, lay in the area of Battersea and Clapham, on the rising ground south of the River Thames. It was a district of terraced houses, of small shops with living quarters above them, of tradesmen who supplied the households of the surrounding streets. Dairies were a common feature of such a quarter in that period, for milk was delivered fresh and daily, and a dairy business of any size required premises, staff, carts, and the keeping of accounts. The streets were lit by gas, the pavements carried a steady traffic of working people through the week, and on Sundays the tempo of the district slowed, the shops closed, and the great volume of movement shifted toward the churches in the morning and toward quiet walks and family visiting in the later hours of the day. Close to Lavender Hill stood Clapham Junction, which in the year 1905 was among the busiest railway junctions in the entire world. Trains from a dozen destinations converged upon it and passed through it in an unbroken procession, day and night. A traveller standing upon its platforms in the evening would have seen the lamps of the signal gantries, the steam rising into the cooling air, and carriage after carriage drawing in and drawing out, bound for Victoria, for London Bridge, for the towns of the Surrey and Sussex countryside, beyond the southern suburbs. It was from this vast and ordinary machinery of movement that Mary Money would step, on the evening of Sunday the 24th of September, and into which she would disappear. The carriages of that period are central to the account that follows, and it is necessary to understand their construction. Many of the trains running south from London in 1905 were composed of compartment carriages without a connecting corridor. A passenger who entered a compartment at a station was sealed within it until the train reached the next stop. There was no passage to other parts of the train, no guard to be summoned between stations, no means of communication with anyone beyond the compartment door. A traveller who found herself alone with a stranger between one station and the next had no recourse and no escape. This was the ordinary condition of railway travel, accepted without alarm by the travelling public, and it is the condition within which this case must be understood. Of Mary Money's own life. Before the events of that September, the surviving record is thin. She was an Englishwoman, 22 years of age in the year 1905. The exact date and place of her birth are not established with certainty in the accessible record, and this account will not assign them. What can be stated is that she was young, unmarried, in regular employment, and consistently described by those who knew her as steady, capable, and well-liked. She was of good character by every account given after her death, a young woman with no known troubles, no known enemies, and no known entanglements that might explain what befell her. She had at least one brother, Robert Money, a dairy farmer of Kingston Hill, who would later be called upon to perform the most difficult of the duties that fall to the family of a victim. The detail of her upbringing, her parents, her schooling, and any earlier employment does not survive in a form that can be relied upon, and it would be improper to invent it. What the record establishes is the shape of her life in its final months. She was employed at a dairy business upon Lavender Hill, a concern owned by a dairyman named Bridger. Her work there was that of a bookkeeper and cashier, the keeping of the accounts of the business, the handling of its receipts, the ordinary clerical labour upon which a small commercial enterprise depended. It was steady and respectable employment for a young woman of her station, and there is no suggestion in the record that she was anything other than competent and trusted in it. After her death, it was reported that her accounts were found to be in order, a detail that would assume some weight in the public discussion of the case, for it removed one of the readiest explanations that might otherwise have been offered for a sudden disappearance. She did not live alone. She lodged at or near the dairy premises, and she shared her accommodation with a fellow employee of the dairy, a young woman named Emma Hone. The two women kept company in the ordinary way of those who live and work in the same place, and it was Emma Hone who would prove to be the last person known to have seen Mary Money at home, and among the last to have spoken with her at all. The arrangement was unremarkable. It was the common circumstance of young working women in the London suburbs of that period, who lodged where they were employed or nearby, who kept modest hours and whose comings and goings were known to those they lived among. It is precisely the unremarkable quality of Mary Money's life that gave the case its later force. She was not a woman whose circumstances invited disaster. She was, by every measure available, an ordinary and blameless young person going quietly about an ordinary life. Now back to the record. The events with which this case is concerned occupy a single evening, the evening of Sunday, the 24th of September, 1905. It is necessary to trace the movements of that evening with care, for they are all that survives of Mary Money's last hours, and each detail was afterward examined and re-examined by the officers charged with the investigation. What follows is drawn from the statements of those who saw her, and it must be understood that beyond a certain point in the evening, the record becomes fragmentary, a matter of glimpses caught by strangers, and that the last portion of her journey can only be reconstructed and never established with certainty. The day had been an ordinary Sunday. In the early evening, at about 7 o'clock, Mary Money left the lodging she shared with Emma Hone. She did not go without a word. She told Emma Hone that she was going for a walk and would not be long. There was nothing in her manner, so far as was afterward reported, to suggest agitation, distress, or any expectation of difficulty. She did not say where she was going, beyond the general remark of a walk, and she gave no indication of any appointments or any person she intended to meet. This absence of any stated destination would later trouble the investigation greatly, for it meant that from the moment she stepped out of doors, no one who knew her could say with authority where she intended to go or whom, if anyone, she intended to see. From the lodging she made her way in the direction of Clapham Junction. Along the way she stopped at a confectioner's shop, a small sweet shop of the kind common to such a district, which is named in one account as the shop of a Miss Golding. There she bought some chocolate. It was an ordinary purchase, the small indulgence of a young woman on a Sunday evening walk, and it would have passed entirely without significance had the evening ended, as such evenings ordinarily did. In the course of this stop she reportedly mentioned that she was going to Victoria. This is the single indication in the record of any intended destination, and it is a slight one, a remark made in passing in a shop, and it must be treated as such. Shortly after this, at about 20 minutes past 7, Mary Money was seen at Clapham Junction by a ticket collector employed there. He observed her upon the station, and he was afterward able to identify her. This man holds a particular place in the record of the case, for he is the last person known to have seen Mary Money alive, who was able to say with certainty that it was she. Beyond his sighting of her at the junction, no person who knew her, and no person able to identify her by name, ever saw her alive again. She carried a purse. The purse was never recovered. From the platform at Clapham Junction, in the ordinary evening traffic of one of the busiest railway junctions in the world, Mary Money passed out of the knowledge of everyone who could name her, and into the fragmentary and terrible record of what followed. It is worth pausing upon the character of the evening at this point, for it frames everything that came after. Mary Money had told her companion she would not be long. She had made a small ordinary purchase. She had, so far as anyone could establish, no appointment, no companion, and no reason to be anywhere other than upon a quiet Sunday walk near her home. She was 22 years of age, in good health, of good character, and in steady employment, with her accounts in order, and no trouble known to anyone who knew her. Within some 4 hours of her leaving her lodging, she would be dead upon a railway line, more than a dozen miles to the south, in a tunnel between two country stations, and the man in whose company she was last glimpsed would never be identified. That is the shape of the case. The remainder of this account is the record of how the fragments of that evening were gathered, and of how, despite every effort, they could not be made to yield an answer. The line upon which Mary Money's body would be found ran south from the London Bridge and Victoria Termini, through the southern suburbs of Croydon and Purley, and on toward the Surrey towns of Merstham, Redhill, and beyond. It was a principal main line, carrying express and stopping trains in a heavy and continuous traffic. Between the station at Purley Oaks and the station at Merstham, the line entered a long brick tunnel driven through the rising ground of the North Downs. The Merstham Tunnel, a structure of considerable length, unlit within, through which the trains passed in darkness and noise. It was within this tunnel, late upon the night of the 24th of September, that the body of Mary Money was found. The circumstances of the discovery were these. Late in the evening of the 24th of September, some little while before 11 o'clock, railway staff came upon the body of a young woman lying upon the track within the Merstham Tunnel. Accounts of the discovery attribute it to men of the railway who had occasion to be within the tunnel that night, workmen who were to carry out repairs upon the line, and the finding of the body is credited in the record to a sub-inspector of the railway police named William Peacock, who came upon her shortly before 11 o'clock. The body lay within the tunnel in the darkness, upon a line carrying a heavy and continuous traffic of trains, and the men who found her did so at considerable hazard to themselves, for a train might pass at any moment. The young woman was dead when found. She had been dead, the medical evidence would afterward indicate, for approximately 1 hour. She lay upon the track with injuries of a severe and immediately fatal character, injuries consistent with a fall or a passage from a train moving at speed through the tunnel. Upon the body there were no papers, no letters, and no railway ticket. There was nothing upon her person by which she might be named. The purse she had carried from her lodging was not with her and was never afterward recovered. A young woman lay dead upon a main railway line, and those who found her could not say who she was. There was, however, one detail present upon the body from the first, and it was this detail that transformed the entire character of the matter. A white silk scarf had been thrust into the mouth of the dead woman. It was not arranged as a scarf is ordinarily worn. It had been forced into her mouth and throat, and it was this circumstance, observed at once by those who examined the body, that removed the death from the category of accident or of self-destruction, and placed it squarely within the category of unlawful killing. A woman who falls from a train, or who casts herself from one, does not do so with a scarf forced into her own mouth. The scarf was the fact around which the whole of the subsequent inquiry would turn, for it declared, plainly and beyond reasonable dispute, that another hand had been at work. The first and most pressing difficulty facing the railway, police and the officers who were summoned was the question of identity. The body carried nothing by which the dead woman could be named. She was young, she was well dressed in the manner of a respectable working woman, and she bore no document of any kind. In such a case the officers were obliged to turn to whatever markings the clothing itself might carry, and it was here that the single thread of identification was found. Stitched into the clothing was a laundry mark, the figures 2, 4, 5. Laundry marks of this kind were the ordinary practice of the period, by which commercial laundries and their customers kept account of garments passing through their hands. The figures 245, traced through the laundry that had applied them, led the officers back to the identity of the dead woman, and so by this slender means Mary Sophia Money was given her name again. Upon the tracing of the laundry mark, word was carried to her family, and on the following morning her brother, Robert Money, the dairy farmer of Kingston Hill, was brought to view the body. He identified his sister. It was he who confirmed to the officers that the young woman found dead within the Merstham tunnel, nameless and marked only by the figures upon her linen, was Mary Sophia Money, 22 years of age, of the dairy upon Lavender Hill, who had left her lodging the evening before to go for a walk, and had said she would not be long. With that identification, the investigation acquired its subject, and the officers were able to begin the work of tracing backward the last hours of a life that had ended in the darkness of the tunnel. The investigation was formally opened, and officers set themselves to the task of reconstructing the journey that had carried Mary Money from the platform at Clapham Junction to the track within the Merstham tunnel. This was no simple matter. She had told no one where she was going. She had bought chocolate at a sweet shop and mentioned Victoria, and she had been seen by a ticket collector at Clapham Junction at about 20 minutes past 7. Between that sighting and the finding of her body, some 3 hours and more later, there was no account given by anyone who knew her. The officers were obliged to gather what they could from strangers, from railway servants who had seen, in the course of their duties, a young woman and a man of whom they took only passing notice at the time, and whose recollections had to be drawn out and set against one another after the fact. From these railway witnesses, a fragmentary picture was assembled, and it must be stressed that it is fragmentary, a matter of glimpses caught by men going about their work, and that no single witness saw the whole of it. A young woman answering the description of Mary Money was seen in a first-class compartment in the company of a young man. She was observed in his company at East Croydon. The same railway guard who had seen them there saw them again at South Croydon, further along the line, and on this second occasion he noted that the two were seated close together within the compartment. To the guard there was nothing alarming in what he saw. A young man and a young woman seated together in a first-class compartment on a Sunday evening were an unremarkable sight, and he passed on about his duties, carrying with him a recollection whose significance would become apparent only afterward. Beyond South Croydon, the line ran on toward Purley and the mouth of the Merstham Tunnel. At the signal box at Purley Oaks, a signalman was on duty, and as a train passed his box he saw, within a first-class carriage, a man and a woman who appeared to be struggling. This was the single sighting that spoke directly to violence. The signalman saw the figures only for the instant that the carriage took to pass his box, in the manner in which a signalman sees the passengers of a passing train, as a succession of lit windows moving swiftly through the night. He could give no more than the impression of a struggle within one compartment of a train running south through his section. It was an impression, caught in an instant and gone, and yet it fell precisely between the last sighting of Mary Money alive in a man's company and the finding of her body upon the line beyond the tunnel. What became of the man was traced as far as the record would allow, and no further. Beyond the tunnel at Redhill, a man was seen to leave the train. He was, so far as could be established, alone. But the young woman who had been seen in his company at East Croydon and again at South Croydon was not with him. She was, by that hour, lying upon the track within the tunnel he had just passed through. The man who stepped down at Redhill and went his way into the evening was the man in whose company Mary Money had last been seen alive, and he was never identified. He was not traced, he was not found, he was not charged. The whole of the description that survives of him is the description given by the railway witnesses who saw him in passing, a young man, thin, wearing a moustache, dressed in a bowler hat, seated in a first-class compartment beside a young woman on a Sunday evening. That description is the sum of what is known of him, and the officers who conducted the investigation could add nothing to it. He is, in the record, only the man on the train. The account of the case must present him in no other terms, for the record establishes no other terms. His name was never learned. His occupation was never learned. Whatever business or acquaintance had brought him into the same compartment as Mary Money, whatever passed between them upon that journey, and whatever hand forced a silk scarf into her mouth, the record does not say and cannot say. He steps down at Redhill and walks out of the account entirely, and the whole subsequent effort of the investigation was, in essence, the failed attempt to follow him. The officers pursued every line that the fragmentary evidence permitted. They examined the interior of the compartment and the tunnel itself. Upon the wall of the tunnel there were marks that were read as evidence bearing upon the manner of Mary Money's death. These marks were taken to indicate that the body had gone from a moving train, rather than that Mary Money had entered the tunnel on foot and met her death there. The reading of such marks was a matter of inference, of the careful examination of the scene by men accustomed to the reading of it, and the conclusion drawn was consistent with the whole of the rest of the evidence, that Mary Money had gone from a first-class carriage of a moving train within the Merstham tunnel, and that she had not gone willingly. The officers traced her movements backward with equal care. They established her purchase of chocolate at the confectioner's shop. They established the sighting by the ticket collector at Clapham Junction. They took the statements of the railway guard who had seen her at East Croydon and South Croydon, and of the signalman at Purley Oaks who had seen the struggle, and of those at Redhill who had seen the man leave the train alone. They gathered, in short, the whole of the fragmentary record that survives, and they set it in order. And having set it in order, they found that it led them to the mouth of the tunnel, and no further, for the one figure who might have answered their questions had walked away from a country platform and could not be found. Among the lines of inquiry pursued was the question of whether Mary Money had gone to keep an appointment. She had told Emma Hone only that she was going for a walk, and would not be long. She had told the confectioner, in passing, that she was going to Victoria. She had told no one of any person she meant to meet. The officers gave close attention to the question of whether she had a suitor, an admirer, or some acquaintance with whom she had arranged to travel that evening, for the presence of the man in the compartment suggested to some that the meeting had not been by chance. Yet nothing was established, no suitor was proven, no arrangement was traced. The theory of a pre-arranged meeting remained a theory, and the officers were careful, as the record must be careful, not to convert a possibility into a fact. One man was investigated and cleared. There was a railway clerk who had been acquainted with Mary Money, and the officers naturally gave attention to any man known to have had dealings with her. This clerk was examined, and he was able to account for his movements upon the evening of the 24th of September. He had an alibi, and upon the strength of it he was cleared and set aside from the inquiry. It is proper to state plainly that this man was investigated and found to have had no part in the death of Mary Money, for the record establishes that he was cleared, and no shadow ought to rest upon a man whom the officers themselves eliminated. With the lines of inquiry gathered and set in order, the officers turned to the medical evidence, for it was upon the findings of the medical examination that the character of the death would finally be established. A post-mortem examination was conducted upon the body of Mary Money, and evidence upon the medical facts was afterward given by a Home Office expert, a medical man of standing whose opinion carried particular weight in matters of unlawful killing. The examination was directed toward the questions that such an examination must always address: the cause of death, the time of death, and the presence or absence of any circumstance that might illuminate the manner in which the death had come about. The medical evidence established that the injuries sustained by Mary Money were severe, and that they were rapidly fatal. They were of a character consistent with a fall or passage from a train moving at speed. the expert was able to state that the injuries had been sufficient to cause death quickly, and that death had followed upon them without any prolonged interval. It is neither necessary nor proper to itemize the injuries, and the record of the case is best served by the plain statement that they were severe, that they were fatal, and that the cause of death was established by competent medical examination. The purpose of the examination was not the cataloguing of injury, but the answering of the questions upon which the inquiry turned, and it is to those answers that attention is properly directed. Upon the question of the time of death, the expert gave evidence that Mary Money had been dead for approximately 1 hour when she was found. This finding, set against the fact that the body was found shortly before 11 o'clock, placed the death at roughly the time at which a particular train had passed through the Merstham Tunnel that night, and the reconstruction of the journey was built in part upon this correspondence of times. The medical evidence and the railway evidence were thus made to bear upon one another. The hour of death as fixed by the physician answering to the passage of the train, as fixed by the timetable and the witnesses, and the two together narrowed the moment of Mary Money's death to a brief span within the darkness of the tunnel. The examination addressed a further question, one that was of importance both to the direction of the inquiry and to the reputation of the dead woman. The expert found no sign of any interference of a sexual character. This finding was of consequence, for it removed one possible motive from consideration, and it protected the memory of Mary Money from a form of speculation that might otherwise have attached itself to the case. Whatever had passed within the compartment, the medical evidence did not support the supposition that she had been assaulted in that manner. The finding was recorded, and it stood as part of the medical picture the inquiry had to weigh. The examination further established that Mary Money had eaten a meal at some interval before her death, an interval estimated at approximately 3 hours. This detail, slight in itself, was of use in the reconstruction of her final evening, for it accorded with the ordinary pattern of a young woman who had taken her Sunday meal and gone out afterward for a walk in the early evening. The medical man was able, from the state of the body, to add this small confirmation to the account that the witnesses had built, and it took its place among the many small and separately unremarkable facts that, gathered together, constituted the whole of what could be known. Above all, the medical evidence returned to the single defining fact, the white silk scarf that had been thrust into the mouth and throat of the dead woman. It was this, more than any injury sustained in the fall from the train, that fixed the character of the death as unlawful killing. The scarf had not come to be in the mouth of Mary Money by any accident of a fall. It had been placed there, forced there, by a deliberate hand, and its presence declared that whatever had befallen Mary Money within the compartment, she had been silenced or overpowered before she went from the train. The medical evidence, taken as a whole, described a young woman who had eaten some hours before, who had been overpowered, and who had died swiftly of severe injuries within the tunnel, and it left no room for the readings of accident or of self-destruction that the bare fact of a body upon a railway line might otherwise have permitted. A coroner's inquest was convened, as the law required, to inquire into the death of Mary Money. The inquest was held in the county of Surrey, within whose bounds the body had been found, and it was conducted before the coroner in the ordinary manner of such proceedings. The precise dates of its sittings and the name of the coroner who presided are not fixed with certainty in the accessible record, and this account will not assign them. What is established is that the inquest was held, that it heard the evidence gathered by the officers and the medical men, and that it addressed itself to the question that every inquest must address, the manner in which the deceased had come by her death. The inquest heard the evidence of identity, the tracing of the laundry mark bearing the figures 245, and the identification of the body by Robert Money. It heard the evidence of Mary Money's last movements, her departure from her lodging, her purchase of chocolate, her sighting at Clapham Junction. It heard the evidence of the railway witnesses, the guard who had seen her at East Croydon and South Croydon, the signalman at Purley Oaks, who had seen the struggle, and those at Redhill who had seen the man leave the train alone. It heard the medical evidence of the Home Office expert as to the cause of death, the time of death, the absence of interference, and above all, the scarf. The whole of the fragmentary record was laid before the coroner and the jury. Upon this evidence, the inquest could reach but one conclusion as to the character of the death. The scarf forced into the mouth, the impression of a struggle seen from the signal box, and the departure of the man alone at Redhill together made it impossible to treat the death as accident or as self-destruction. The death of Mary Money was unlawful killing. Yet the same evidence that established the fact of murder established also the limit of what the inquest could do, for the man who had been seen in her company could not be named. He had not been traced. There was no person before the coroner to be charged, no individual against whom the evidence pointed by name. The inquest returned its verdict accordingly. It returned an open verdict, finding that she had met her death through injuries caused by a train, but that the evidence was insufficient to show whether she had been thrown from the train or had fallen from it. No individual was named in the verdict. No person was committed for trial. The verdict declared the fact of murder and declared in the same breath the failure to attach that murder to any living man. It was the verdict that the evidence compelled and the only verdict the evidence permitted, and it left the case precisely where the investigation had left it, at the mouth of the tunnel, with the man on the train walking away from a country platform and out of reach. With the verdict of the coroner's jury, the formal legal process reached its end, for there was no trial to follow it. A trial requires a defendant, and there was no defendant. No one was ever charged with the murder of Mary Money. No man was arrested, committed, arraigned, or tried. The absence of any trial is not a gap in the record of this case but a defining feature of it, for the whole of the machinery of the criminal law, the assizes, the barristers, the jury, the sentence, stood ready and had nothing to act upon. The record of the case simply runs out at the inquest, and the great apparatus of prosecution that would ordinarily have followed the finding of wilful murder was never set in motion because the person against whom it would have moved was never found. The absence of a trial did not mean the absence of public attention. The death of Mary Money became, in the autumn of 1905, and for a considerable time afterward, a national sensation. The case was reported at length in the newspapers of the day, and it fixed itself in the public mind under a name drawn from the place of its ending. It became known as the Merstham Tunnel Mystery. The elements that made it so gripping to the public were precisely those that had defeated the officers. Here was a young woman of unblemished character, in steady employment, with her accounts in order and no trouble known to anyone, who had gone out one Sunday evening for a walk, and had been found dead within a few hours upon a railway line more than a dozen miles away, murdered in a first-class compartment of a moving express, with a silk scarf forced into her mouth, and with the man in whose company she had last been seen, vanished without a trace. The public followed the case with a particular intensity because of the setting in which it had occurred. Railway travel was, in the year 1905, the ordinary condition of respectable life. Clerks and shopkeepers and their families travelled by train daily and thought nothing of it. Women travelled alone by train as a matter of course, and did so without fear. The murder of Mary Money struck at the confidence of the travelling public, for it suggested that the enclosed compartment of a moving train, sealed between stations and beyond the reach of help, might become the scene of a killing from which there was no escape, and after which the killer might simply step down at the next station and walk away. The case gave form to an anxiety that had lain beneath the surface of the railway age, the fear of what might happen to a passenger alone in a compartment with a stranger, and it is in part this that accounts for the grip the case took upon the public imagination. The comparison most often drawn in the public discussion of the case was with an earlier railway murder that had fixed itself in the national memory. In the year 1864, a man named Thomas Briggs had been attacked and killed within a railway carriage between stations, in a case that had shocked the country and had led in time to changes in the design of carriages and to a heightened awareness of the peculiar dangers of the enclosed compartment. The murder of Mary Money was set beside that earlier case as a second and terrible instance of the same peril. The passenger alone in a sealed compartment, beyond the reach of any help, at the mercy of whoever shared it. The two cases together came to stand in the public imagination for the hidden dangers of the railway, and the name of Mary Money was spoken alongside that of Thomas Briggs as one of the classic instances of murder upon the line. The Merstham Tunnel mystery secured a lasting place in the literature of British crime. It became a fixture of the accounts of unsolved murders that were compiled in the decades that followed, and it has been retold in the histories of railway crime and in the compendia of cases that were never brought to a conclusion. It features in the official crime history maintained by the British Transport Police, the institutional successor to the railway policing of Mary Money's own day, and it is recorded there among the notable cases in the long history of crime upon the railways. It has been the subject of articles and of chapters and of retellings by later writers drawn to its combination of an ordinary victim, a public setting, and an ending that was never supplied. The persistence of the case in the record owes much to the very fact of its remaining unsolved. A murder brought to trial and answered with a verdict passes, in time, into the settled history of the law. A murder that is never answered remains open, and the openness is itself a kind of preservation, for each generation that comes to the case finds the same fragmentary evidence and the same unanswered question, the identity of the man who stepped down at Redhill and walked away. The case endures not because it was resolved, but because it was not, and it has continued to be examined, precisely because the examination has never been able to reach its end. The setting in which the murder of Mary Money occurred deserves fuller description, for it bears directly upon the manner of her death and upon the failure to bring anyone to account for it. The South London suburbs through which her final journey began were, in the year 1905, districts in the full course of their growth. Battersea and Clapham had been transformed within living memory from fields and scattered villages into dense quarters of terraced housing, drawn together and knit into the fabric of the metropolis by the railways that ran through them. The population of these districts was largely of the respectable working and lower middle classes, the clerks and tradesmen and shop workers and small proprietors upon whom the commercial life of the capital depended, and among whom Mary Money and her employer and her fellow lodgers were entirely typical. The dairy trade, in which Mary Money was employed, was itself a characteristic institution of such a district. Before the general availability of refrigeration, milk was supplied fresh and daily to the households of the city, and the urban dairy was a familiar feature of the London streets. A dairy of any substance kept cattle or drew its supply from the country by rail, maintained premises for the handling and sale of milk, employed roundsmen to make the daily deliveries, and required, as any commercial concern required, the keeping of accounts and the handling of money. It was in this last capacity that Mary Money was employed, and her position as bookkeeper and cashier placed her among the trusted employees of the business, handling its receipts and keeping its books, a position of modest responsibility suited to a capable and respectable young woman. The rhythm of the Sunday upon which she died was the rhythm of the district itself. Through the week, the streets carried the heavy traffic of a working population, the carts and the roundsmen and the crowds going to and from the railway stations. Upon the Sunday, the shops were shut, the pace of the streets slackened, and the day divided itself between the observances of the morning and the quieter occupations of the afternoon and evening. A walk in the early evening was among the most ordinary of Sunday occupations, a thing done by thousands of respectable people in every quarter of the city, and it was upon such a walk, in the ordinary way, of a Sunday evening that Mary Money set out and did not return. Clapham Junction, toward which she made her way, was the great nexus of the railway system of South London, and its scale in the year 1905 is difficult to overstate. It was among the busiest railway junctions in the world, a place through which an immense volume of traffic passed in an unceasing procession. Its platforms carried a constant movement of passengers between the lines that converged upon it, and its signal gantries and points directed a traffic of trains that ran throughout the day and far into the night. For a young woman to make her way to such a place upon a Sunday evening, and to take a train from it, was to do nothing that thousands of others were not doing at the same hour. It was the very ordinariness of the act that made her disappearance into it so complete. For a single traveller among the crowds of Clapham Junction was a figure whom no one had any reason to mark or to remember. The line upon which she died ran south from the capital into the county of Surrey, climbing gradually toward the chalk ridge of the North Downs. The country through which it passed grew more open as it went, the dense suburbs giving way to the smaller towns of Purley and Coulsdon and Merstham, and to the fields and woods of the downland beyond. The Merstham Tunnel carried the line through the ridge itself, a long passage of brick driven through the chalk, unlit within, in which the trains ran through a darkness broken only by the lamps of their own carriages. It was a structure of the ordinary engineering of the railway age, one of many such tunnels upon the lines out of London, and it had carried its traffic without incident for many years before the night upon which the body of Mary Money was found within it. The men who worked the line through the hours of darkness were a settled and disciplined body. The signalmen in their boxes, the plate layers and gangers who maintained the track, the guards and porters and inspectors who kept the traffic moving through the night. It was such men who found Mary Money, and it was upon the observations of such men that the whole of the reconstruction of her journey depended. The signalman at Purley Oaks, watching the trains pass his box through the night, as it was his duty to do, the guard who had noted a young couple in a first-class compartment, the railway police who searched the tunnel, all of these belonged to the world of the working railway, and it was that world, and not the world of Mary Money's own quiet district, that furnished the last glimpses of her alive and the first knowledge of her death. The enclosed first-class compartment in which she made her final journey was, as has been described, sealed between stations, without corridor or connection to the remainder of the train. It offered privacy, and it was for privacy that the first-class passenger paid. Upon a Sunday evening, a young woman and a young man seated together in such a compartment presented, to the guard who saw them, a picture of the most ordinary respectability. The privacy that the compartment offered was, in the ordinary run of things, a comfort and a convenience. Upon the night of the 24th of September, it became the instrument of a killing, for it placed Mary Money alone, with a man beyond the reach of any help between the stations, and it allowed that man, when the train drew in at Redhill, to step down and walk away as though nothing had occurred within it. The laundry mark by which Mary Money was at last given back her name deserves a word, for it was the single thread of identity upon a body otherwise stripped of every document. The commercial laundries of the period marked the garments passing through their hands with numbers and symbols, applied in indelible ink or stitched into the fabric, by which each customer's linen might be kept separate and accounted for. The figures 245 worked into the clothing of the dead woman were of no meaning to those who first found her, and yet they were the one piece of information the body carried, and it was by the patient tracing of those figures back through the laundry that had applied them that the officers arrived at the name of Mary Money. That a young woman could be reduced, in death, to a number stitched into her linen, and identified only by the tracing of that number, is among the plainer facts of the case, and it speaks to the completeness with which she had been stripped of every other means of recognition. The difficulties that defeated the investigation were of a particular kind, and they are worth setting out plainly, for they explain how a murder so widely reported and so closely examined could nonetheless end without an arrest. The first difficulty was that Mary Money had told no one of her destination or her purpose. She had said only that she was going for a walk and would not be long, and she had mentioned Victoria in passing to a shopkeeper. There was, in consequence, no starting point for the inquiry beyond the bare fact of her leaving. The officers could not begin from a known appointment or a named companion. They could begin only from the platform at Clapham Junction and work forward through the observations of strangers. And forward from that platform, the trail led within a few hours to a body upon the line, and no further. The second difficulty was the nature of the witnesses upon whom the reconstruction depended. They were railway servants who had seen a young woman and a man in the course of their duties and who had taken no particular notice of them at the time, because there had been nothing to take notice of. A young couple in a first-class compartment was among the most ordinary of sights. The guard who saw them at East Croydon and again at South Croydon had no reason to study their faces or to fix them in his memory, and when he was afterward called upon to describe the man, he could give only the general impression that a passing glance affords. The signalman at Purley Oaks had seen the struggle for the instant that a train takes to pass a signal box, a succession of lit windows moving swiftly through the dark, and from that instant no detailed description of the man could be drawn. The evidence, in short, was the evidence of glimpses, and glimpses do not furnish the particulars by which a stranger may be traced. The third difficulty was the completeness with which the man had removed himself. He had stepped down at Redhill and walked away, and from that moment there was no thread to follow. He had left nothing behind by which he might be known. He had spoken to no one who could name him. Whatever ticket he had carried, whatever destination he had been bound for, whatever name he might have given had anyone asked it, none of these was recorded because at the moment he left the train, no one yet knew that a murder had been done, and by the time the body was found and the alarm raised, he was long gone into the ordinary traffic of an Edwardian evening. A man who leaves no trace, and whom no witness can describe with precision, cannot be found, and he was not found. The purse that Mary Money had carried from her lodging was never recovered, and its absence was itself a matter to which the officers gave attention. Whether it had been taken from her, or lost from the train, or disposed of by the man who had shared her compartment, could not be determined. Its disappearance raised the question of robbery as a possible motive, yet the case did not sit easily as a simple robbery, for the manner of the killing, the scarf forced into the mouth, the struggle within the compartment, spoke of something other than the swift work of a thief. The officers could not say whether the purse had been the object of the attack, or merely one of its incidental losses, and the question, like so many others in the case, was raised and could not be answered. The theory that most occupied the public and the investigators alike was that Mary Money had gone out that evening to keep a meeting with a man, a meeting arranged in advance and kept secret from those with whom she lived. The presence of the man in the compartment, the intimacy noted by the guard, who had seen the two seated close together at South Croydon, and the direction of her journey away from her home and out into the country, all lent themselves to this reading. Yet the reading remained a reading and never became a fact. No letter arranging such a meeting was found. No confidant came forward to say that Mary Money had spoken of a man she meant to see. Her fellow lodger, Emma Hone, had been told only of a walk. If there was an arrangement, it had been kept so close that it died with her, and the officers were left with a theory that fitted the fragments and yet could be proven by none of them. It is a measure of the care with which the officers approached the case that they were unwilling to convert this theory into an accusation. They did not name the man on the train as a lover, because they could not prove that he was one. They did not assert that Mary Money had gone to meet him, because they could not prove that she had. The link between the woman who left her lodging for a walk and the man who sat beside her in the compartment was never established as anything more than the fact that the two were seen together, and the officers, and the inquest after them, confined themselves to what the evidence would bear. The man remained the man on the train, and the nature of whatever had brought him and Mary Money into the same compartment remained unknown. The identification of the body by Robert Money on the morning after the discovery was the point at which the case ceased to be the mystery of an unknown woman and became the tragedy of a known one. Until that morning, the dead woman had been a figure without a name, identified only by the figures upon her linen. With the arrival of her brother, she was restored to her family and her history, and the investigation acquired both its subject and its urgency. For the murder of a nameless stranger and the murder of Mary Sophia Money of the Lavender Hill Dairy were in the public mind two very different things. It was the second that seized the attention of the country, and it did so because Mary Money was so entirely the sort of young woman whose murder was not supposed to happen. The newspapers of 1905 devoted a great volume of attention to the case, and they returned to it repeatedly as the weeks passed and no arrest was made. The reporting dwelt upon the respectability of the victim, upon the ordinariness of her final evening, upon the sinister detail of the scarf, and upon the tantalizing incompleteness of the evidence. The man seen and never named, the struggle glimpsed and never explained. The name the Merstham Tunnel mystery, once attached, fixed the case in the public memory and carried it beyond the immediate weeks of its investigation into the longer life it has enjoyed in the literature of unsolved crime. The public appetite for the case was sustained precisely by the fact that it offered no resolution, and each fresh report that carried no news of an arrest served only to deepen the mystery rather than to exhaust the interest in it. The confidence of the railway age, which had made a young woman's solitary evening journey so unremarkable, was among the casualties of the case. In the years before the murder of Mary Money, the travelling public had grown accustomed to the railway as the safe and ordinary machinery of daily movement, and women travelled alone upon it in their thousands without a thought of danger. The revelation that a respectable young woman could be murdered within a first-class compartment of a moving express, upon a principal main line, within a dozen miles of the heart of the capital, and that her killer could step down at a country station and vanish, struck at that confidence in a manner that the reporting of the day made much of. The enclosed compartment, so long regarded as a convenience and a comfort, was shown to be also a place in which a passenger might be beyond all help, and the case gave a sharp and particular form to the anxieties that attend the travel of women alone. Yet for all the attention the case received, and for all the resources brought to bear upon it, the essential facts remained as they had been at the mouth of the tunnel. A young woman had gone out for a Sunday walk and had been found murdered upon a railway line. A man had been seen in her company and had walked away unidentified. A scarf had been forced into her mouth by a hand that was never named. The laundry mark had given her back her name, and the medical evidence had fixed the manner and the hour of her death, and the railway witnesses had traced the outline of her final journey. And when all of this had been gathered and set in order, it pointed to a man who could not be found. The investigation, conducted with care and pursued through every line the evidence allowed, arrived at the certainty that Mary Money had been murdered and at the impossibility of saying by whom. The officers did not close the matter for want of effort. They traced her movements backward to the sweet shop and the ticket collector. They took the statements of the guard and the signalman and the men at Redhill. They examined the tunnel and read the marks upon its wall. They investigated and cleared the railway clerk who had known her. They pursued the theory of a pre-arranged meeting to the end of what the evidence would support. They gave the case the attention that its gravity and its public prominence demanded. And at the end of all of it, the man on the train remained a description and not a name. A thin young man in a bowler hat with a moustache, seen in passing by tired railway servants on a Sunday night, and gone from the record the moment he stepped down at Redhill. The purse was never found. The scarf was never traced to any owner but the dead woman it had silenced. The man was never identified. The appointment, if there had been one, was never confirmed. The motive, whether robbery or something darker and more personal, was never established. Each of the questions that the case raised was pursued, and each in its turn was left unanswered. And the sum of these unanswered questions is the case as it has come down through the record, a murder fully established and never solved, a victim fully known, and a killer never named. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the first case ends. We turn now to a second story, older than the first and far less remembered, one that unfolded more than 60 years earlier and many miles from the capital, in a small Kentish market town where the chapel bell ordered the week and every household was known to its neighbours. It is a quieter case and a stranger one, and it turns upon the same question that no inquest could finally answer. The case of Harriet Monckton begins in Bromley, in the county of Kent, in the autumn of the year 1843. Bromley was then a modest market town some 10 miles to the southeast of London, set among the farmland and orchards of the North Downs, and only beginning to feel the reach of the growing capital. It was a town of a few thousand inhabitants, arranged along a broad market street, with its parish church, its inns, its shops, and its chapels of the various dissenting congregations that had taken root there over the preceding century. The London road passed through it, and carriers moved between the town and the city. But Bromley, in 1843, remained a place governed less by commerce than by acquaintance, where a face out of its usual place was noticed and remarked upon. The year was the 6th of the reign of Queen Victoria, and the country was in the earlier part of what would become a long age of railways, reform, and expansion. The railway had not yet reached Bromley itself, and the town kept much of the character of an older England, where the rhythm of life was set by the market, the season, and the Sabbath. Fields and market gardens pressed close upon the streets. Beyond the last houses lay lanes and hedgerows, and the great houses of the local gentry. The town was large enough to hold a mixed population of tradesmen, labourers, shopkeepers, and professional men, and small enough that the affairs of any one of them might quickly become the common property of all. Among the institutions that shaped the moral and social life of such a town, the dissenting chapel held a particular place. Bromley possessed a congregational or independent chapel, a community of worshippers who stood apart from the established Church of England and governed their spiritual affairs by their own lights. Such congregations were tightly knit and inward-looking. They kept their own registers of membership, disciplined their own members in matters of conduct, and maintained a schedule of worship, prayer meetings, and Sunday school instruction that filled the week for those most closely involved. Reputation within the congregation was a possession of real value, and the loss of it a matter of consequence. It was within this community, and not the wider parish, that the life of Harriet Monckton was chiefly lived. The chapel stood with its yard and its outbuildings a little back from the public way, in the manner of dissenting meeting houses of the period, which were often built modestly and without display. Behind the chapel, as behind most such buildings and most houses of the town, stood an outdoor privy for the use of those who attended. The interior of the chapel was plain, its services long, and its congregation earnest. The Sunday school gathered the children of the members and of the poorer families of the town for instruction in reading and in scripture, and the teaching of that school was undertaken by the more capable and trusted of the younger members. Harriet Monckton was one of these. The Bromley of 1843 was then a town of settled habits and close observation of chapel and market and known faces, lit at that season by the short days and long darkness of a Kentish November. It is against this quiet and orderly background that the events of the case must be set, for the strangeness of what occurred lay precisely in its setting. A death of this kind might have passed with less remark in the crowded and anonymous districts of the capital. In Bromley, it fell upon a community that knew the dead woman, knew the men and women around her, and could not thereafter look upon any of them in the same way. Harriet Monckton was, at the time of her death, 23 years of age. She was an unmarried young woman of respectable parentage and settled religious habits, literate, and by every outward measure well thought of by those who knew her. She had received an education sufficient to make her fit for the work of teaching, and she served as a teacher in the Sunday school attached to the Congregational Chapel. This was a position of some trust given only to those whose character and conduct were held to be beyond reproach, for the teachers of the young were expected to be examples as well as instructors. That Harriet Monckton held such a place indicates the regard in which she was held by the congregation before her death. The fuller particulars of her early life are only partly preserved in the records available for this account. The names and occupations of her parents, the place of her birth, the number and names of her brothers and sisters, and the details of her schooling are not established with certainty in the accessible summaries, and where the record is silent, it is not the practice of this account to supply what it does not know. What can be stated with confidence is that she came from a respectable family, that she was raised within the discipline of a religious household, that she was literate and capable, and that she had made herself useful and valued within the life of her chapel. These are the facts that bear upon the case, and they are enough to establish the position she occupied in the eyes of the town. She was, in short, exactly the kind of young woman whom the community would least have expected to find at the centre of a scandal or a crime. She belonged to the respectable, chapel-going order of the town, the order that policed its own conduct and prided itself upon its propriety. She taught the children of her neighbours. She attended worship and the meetings of the congregation. She lodged, as many unmarried young women of her station then did, in the households of others, moving from one set of rooms to another as circumstances required, and she was accordingly known to a number of families who had, at one time or another, given her a room. Her life was woven into the ordinary fabric of the town, and her movements were, for the most part, the movements of any respectable young woman of Bromley in that year. Yet beneath this settled and unremarkable surface, Harriet Monckton was concealing a circumstance that would have destroyed her standing in the community had it been known. At the time of her death, she was approximately 6 months advanced in pregnancy. This condition she had kept hidden from nearly everyone in her circle. In the moral order of a dissenting congregation of the 1840s, an unmarried woman known to be with child-faced ruin, the loss of her position, her reputation, and her place in the community that had been the whole of her world. The concealment of such a condition was therefore not merely a private matter, but a desperate one, and it is the hidden fact from which the whole of the case proceeds. A young woman trusted and respected by all around her carried a secret that, by its nature, someone else must have shared. The identity of the father of her unborn child was never established. It was never established by the inquest that sat upon her death, nor by the police who were brought to investigate it, nor by the town that speculated upon it for years afterward, nor has it been established since. This is among the central and permanent uncertainties of the case, and it must be stated plainly at the outset and held to throughout. For much that was said and suspected in the months and years that followed turned upon it. The record does not name the man. This account will not name him either, and will treat every individual who fell under suspicion as suspected only, which is all that the evidence ever made of any of them. Harriet Monckton had, in the ordinary course of her life in Bromley, formed acquaintance and connection with a number of persons who would afterward be examined in relation to her death. There was a young man of the congregation who had courted her, a tradesman of the town by occupation. There were the ministers and men connected with the chapel she attended, and with a neighbouring congregation. There was a former landlord in whose house she had at an earlier time lodged. There was a close female companion, herself connected with the work of teaching, who was among the last of her circle to have dealings with her. None of these connections was in itself out of the ordinary for a young woman of her situation. Each of them would take on a different colour after the 7th of November, when the circumstances of her death caused every relation she had formed to be looked upon with suspicion. If you find value in histories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. What follows begins in Bromley in the year 1843. In the ordinary reckoning of the town, Harriet Monckton was a young woman whose days were passed between her lodgings, her chapel, and the school in which she taught, and whose future, so far as anyone had cause to consider it, lay along the settled lines that such a life laid down. She was known to attend worship faithfully. She was known to keep company with the respectable members of her congregation. She was known to be diligent in her teaching and modest in her manner. Nothing in the outward record of her days gave warning of what was to come, and it is this very ordinariness that the case would afterwards set against the extraordinary fact of her death. The months preceding November of 1843 are, in their documented particulars, the months of an unremarkable life, carried on under the weight of a concealed and advancing condition. She continued to move among the households of the town, to keep her place in the congregation, and to maintain the appearance of an untroubled young woman. How far she confided in anyone, and in whom, are questions that the inquest would labour over at great length and never fully resolve. What is certain is that her situation could not have remained hidden indefinitely, that the term of concealment still available to her was short, and that whatever arrangements she had made or hoped to make for herself were, by the autumn of that year, pressing upon her with a nearness that those around her did not perceive. The particular circumstances of her lodging in that autumn bear upon the case, for they placed her in daily proximity to persons who would afterward be examined, and they left her, as a single woman dependent upon the goodwill of others, for a roof without a household of her own, in which her comings and goings answered to no one but herself. She had lodged, at various times, in more than one house in the town. She had, at an earlier period, taken a room in the house of a man who kept a lodging, and who would later be numbered among those upon whom suspicion fell. In the manner of her class and situation, her privacy was always partial, her movements always observable, and her secrets always at the mercy of those under whose roof she passed her nights. The advancing condition she carried would, in the ordinary course, have compelled some resolution before many more weeks had passed. A pregnancy of 6 months cannot be concealed indefinitely beneath the dress of the period, and a young woman in her position must have known that the term of secrecy remaining to her was measured in weeks. Whatever she intended, whatever provision she had sought or been promised, the pressure of that approaching term formed the background against which the events of the 6th of November must be understood. It is not the practice of this account to speculate upon her state of mind, for the record does not establish it, but the plain circumstance of her condition and its nearness to discovery is a documented fact and a material one. Upon the evening of the 6th of November, in the year 1843, Harriet Monckton left the place where she was then lodging and went out into the town. It was a November evening in Kent, and the darkness came early at that season, so that by the hour she departed, the streets would have been unlit save by the lamps of the houses and the inns. She was seen in the course of that evening, in the company of others of her circle, and her movements during those hours would afterward be reconstructed, hour by hour, and person by person, in the long proceedings of the inquest. She had dealings that evening with more than one member of the congregation. She took tea at one point in company. She was, for a portion of the evening, in the society of the very persons who would later be examined regarding her death. She did not return to her lodging that night. This was the fact that first gave rise to concern, though the alarm it raised was not immediate, for a young woman might have any number of innocent reasons for passing a night elsewhere among friends. When morning came and she had neither returned nor sent word, inquiry began to be made, the search did not last long. On the following day, the 7th of November, the body of Harriet Monckton was found in the privy behind the Congregational Chapel, the very chapel in which she had worshipped and in whose Sunday school she had taught. She was dead. The discovery of a body in such a place, and of such a person, threw the town at once into a condition of alarm and rumour that it would not shake off for years. The privy stood behind the chapel, among its outbuildings, in the yard through which the members of the congregation passed on their way to worship. That the body of a respected young teacher of the Sunday school should be found there, upon a November morning, was a circumstance so far outside the ordinary experience of the town as to seem scarcely credible to those who first learned of it. Word passed quickly through Bromley, as such word did in a place where all were known to all, and by the day's end there could have been few households in the town that had not heard some version of what had occurred. The body was recovered from the place where it had been found, and the first examination of it was undertaken. It became apparent upon that examination that Harriet Monckton had not died of any natural cause. There was, moreover, the further discovery made upon the examination of the body that she had been some 6 months advanced in pregnancy, a fact that until that moment had been known, so far as could be told, to almost no one in the town. The two discoveries together, the manner of the death and the condition of the deceased, transformed the matter at a stroke from a sudden and unexplained death into a scandal and a suspected crime, and set in motion the long train of inquiry that followed. The examination of the body was conducted by a surgeon in the manner then usual in cases of sudden or suspicious death. The surgeon determined that the cause of death was poisoning by prussic acid, which is the substance also known as hydrogen cyanide. It is a poison that acts with great rapidity and in small quantity, and it was, in that period, obtainable and employed in various trades and in the preparation of certain medicines, so that its presence in the town was not in itself a remarkable thing. The surgeon further established, as has been said, the fact of the pregnancy. Beyond the determination of the cause of death and the condition of the deceased, this account will not enter into the particulars of the medical examination, for the essential findings are these two, and they are sufficient to the case. It was in the surrounding circumstances, rather than in the medical findings alone, that the difficulty of the case first declared itself, and it was a difficulty that would never be resolved. A death by prussic acid might, in the abstract, be the result of self-destruction as readily as of murder, and the question of whether Harriet Monckton had taken her own life or been killed by the hand of another was raised at the very outset and would be argued over throughout the proceedings that followed. Yet there was, from the beginning, a circumstance that told strongly against the theory of self-destruction. No bottle, no vessel, no container of any kind that might have held the poison was found with the body or in the place where she lay. This absence was a matter of the first importance, and it was seized upon at once by those who considered the case. A person who takes poison must have some vessel from which to take it, and that vessel, in the ordinary course, remains near the body. The prussic acid that killed Harriet Monckton had been contained in something, and that something was not there to be found. If she had destroyed herself, the vessel should have lain beside her. Its absence pointed to the presence of another hand, a hand that had administered or supplied the poison and then removed the evidence of it from the scene. It was upon this reasoning, more than upon any other single circumstance, that the case came to be treated as one of murder rather than of suicide, and it was this reasoning that would in the end be reflected in the verdict. The gravity of the matter and the standing of the persons who were at once drawn into it ensured that the investigation would not be left to the ordinary resources of a country town. Bromley in 1843 possessed no detective force of its own capable of unravelling a poisoning within a respectable congregation, and the case was of a character to attract notice well beyond the boundaries of the town. Officers were accordingly brought down from London to assist in the inquiry. The Metropolitan Police, whose detective capacity was in those years still in its earliest infancy, became involved in the matter, and the file that was opened upon the case would in time find its place among the records of that force, where it survives to this day. The interest of the authorities in London reflected the seriousness with which the death was regarded, and the sense that a country coroner and a handful of local men could not alone be equal to it. The investigation, once opened, proceeded along the only path that the circumstances allowed, which was the patient examination of every person who had had dealings with Harriet Monckton in the hours and the weeks before her death. There was no witness to the administering of the poison. There was no confession. There was no physical object, no bottle, no letter conclusively fixing the deed upon any one person. The whole of the inquiry turned, therefore, upon the reconstruction of her movements and her relations, upon the testimony of those who had seen her and spoken with her, and upon the attempt to determine which among the persons close to her had the knowledge of her condition, and with it a reason to wish her silenced. Statements were taken. The persons who had been in her company on the evening of the 6th of November were questioned as to what had passed. The households in which she had lodged were inquired into. The circle of the chapel was gone over, member by member. Among the persons who came under the scrutiny of the investigation was the young man of the congregation who had courted her. He was, by his trade, a shoemaker, and he was employed also in the collecting of debts. He had kept company with Harriet Monckton, and the nature and extent of his attachment to her became a matter of close inquiry. His movements upon the evening in question, his knowledge or ignorance of her condition, and the character of his dealings with her were all examined at length. It must be stated with the greatest plainness that he was never charged, never tried, and never established by any evidence to have been concerned in her death. He fell under suspicion, as did others, because he had been close to her, and closeness to the deceased was, in a case with no direct evidence, the only thread the investigation had to follow. He is named here as a person examined, and as nothing more. The ministers and men connected with the chapel were also drawn into the inquiry, for the death had occurred upon the very ground of their congregation, and the deceased had been one of their number. The minister of the Bromley Congregational Chapel and a clergyman connected with a neighbouring congregation were among the men within the chapel circle whose relations with Harriet Monckton and whose conduct fell to be considered. Here again the distinction must be drawn with care, for to be questioned in the course of such an inquiry is not to be accused of the crime. These were men within the community upon whom the general scrutiny fell, men who had known the deceased and moved in the same narrow world she had moved in, and their examination formed part of the wider effort to understand the circumstances of her life and death. The record does not establish any of them as her killer, and this account does not present them as such. There was, further, the former landlord, the man in whose house Harriet Monckton had, at an earlier time, taken a room, who was numbered among those upon whom suspicion rested. His name is not reliably fixed in the sources available for this account, and it will not be stated here, for it is not the practice of this account to attach a surname to a suspicion that the record does not support. That such a man existed, that he had given her lodging at an earlier period, and that he was among the persons the investigation considered, is what can be said. What his relations with her had truly been, and whether they bore any connection to her death, the inquiry did not establish. There was also a close female companion within her circle, herself connected with the work of teaching, who had had dealings with Harriet Monckton, and who figured in the reconstruction of her final days. Her part in the matter was that of a witness and an associate, one of those whose testimony helped to build a picture of the deceased's last hours and her state in the weeks before. The accumulation of such testimony, from the men who had courted or lodged or worshipped with her, and from the women who had been her companions, formed the substance of the investigation. For in the absence of any material proof, it was only from the mouths of those who had known her that the truth, if it were to be had at all, might be drawn. The investigation proceeded in this manner over a period far longer than was usual in cases of sudden death, for the ordinary course, by which an inquest sat within days of a death and rendered its verdict without prolonged delay, could not be followed here. There was too much to examine, and too little that could be fixed with certainty. The officers who had come from London went over the ground, and the persons a second time, and a third. The households of the town were revisited. Each new statement raised fresh questions, and each fresh question required the recalling of witnesses already heard. The inquiry took on, in consequence, a character of great and unusual length, and it became apparent that the matter would not be quickly closed. The essential difficulty was one that no amount of diligence could overcome. In a case of poisoning, unlike a case of open violence, there need be no struggle, no outcry, no mark upon the ground, no weapon left behind. The prussic acid had done its work swiftly and quietly, and the only vessel that might have carried it had been removed. There remained no witness who had seen the poison given, and no person who would own to any part in her death. The investigation could establish who had been near her, and who had known, or might have known, her condition, but it could not cross the space between suspicion and proof. That space it never crossed. Every person examined remained a person merely examined, and the identity of the hand that had supplied or administered the poison stayed throughout beyond the reach of the inquiry. To this state of affairs the interest of the Home Office was in due course added, for the case had by now grown beyond the compass of a country town and touched upon matters of general concern. The involvement of the London police, the length of the proceedings, and the manner of the death together gave the affair a prominence that carried it to the notice of the higher authorities of the state. Yet the interest of those authorities, however earnest, could add nothing to the evidence. They could direct that the inquiry be pressed, but they could not supply the witness or the proof that did not exist. The reach of the case beyond Bromley is a measure of the alarm it caused. It is not a measure of any progress toward a solution. For progress toward a solution, there was none. Within the town itself, the effect of the prolonged inquiry was corrosive. The congregation of the chapel, which had numbered the dead woman among its own, and upon whose ground she had been found, was drawn into the centre of the affair, and could not extricate itself. Its ministers had been questioned. Its members had been questioned. The young man who had courted her, the households that had lodged her, the companions who had known her, all belonged to that same narrow community, and the suspicion that fell upon them fell in some measure upon the whole. A congregation that had prided itself upon its order and its propriety found itself the object of the town's speculation, and the bonds of trust that had held it together were strained by the knowledge that one among its number, in all likelihood, knew far more of the matter than had been told. The chapel fractured under the weight of the scrutiny it could not escape, and the town filled with rumour that no verdict would ever wholly still. The formal instrument by which the death was to be examined and a verdict rendered was the coroner's inquest, and in this case that instrument was employed over a span of time almost without precedent. The inquest upon the death of Harriet Monckton did not sit once or twice, or for a few days and then conclude. It sat, adjourned, and resumed again over a period reaching across some 3 years, from the year of her death in 1843 onward into the middle of the decade. It was among the longest-running inquests of its era, and its very length became a part of the notoriety of the case. Session followed session, and adjournment followed adjournment, as the coroner and the jury laboured to make sense of a death that would not yield its secret. The inquest sat in the town in the manner then customary, in premises suited to the gathering of a coroner, a jury, and the witnesses to be examined. A sitting of the inquest is recorded as having been held at an inn of the town. the Swan and Mitre, which served, as inns of the period often did, as a place where such public business might be conducted. There the jurymen assembled, there the witnesses were called and sworn, and there, over the course of the long proceedings, the depositions accumulated that would form the surviving record of the case. The taking and preserving of those depositions was, in the end, the most lasting product of the inquest, for while it could not name a killer, it could and did set down, in writing, the testimony of those who had known the deceased, and that written record has outlived by a great span of years the town's memory of the affair. The witnesses called before the inquest were those whom the investigation had examined, the members of the chapel circle who had had dealings with Harriet Monckton in her life and in her final hours. The young man who had courted her gave his account. The men connected with the chapel gave theirs. The persons who had been in her company on the evening of the 6th of November were examined as to what had passed between them and her. The companion who had known her final days was heard. Each was questioned, and the answers of each were set down, and from the whole there emerged a detailed picture of the last evening of her life and of the relations that had surrounded her, though not the one thing the inquest most desired, which was the identity of the person responsible for her death. The record notes that the coroner who presided over the inquest had formed his own view of where the guilt in the matter lay. A coroner in that period was a figure of considerable authority within his own court, empowered to direct the inquiry, to examine the witnesses, and to guide the jury toward a verdict. In this case, the coroner is said to have held an opinion as to the guilty party. The jury, however, did not follow him. Whatever the coroner believed, the men of the jury were not persuaded to translate his belief into a verdict against any named person, for the evidence before them did not support such a finding, and a verdict against an individual, in the absence of proof, was a thing they would not return. The name of the coroner who presided is not established with certainty in the sources available for this account, and it will not be stated here. After the passage of some 3 years, after the many sittings and adjournments, after the accumulation of testimony, and the exhaustion of every avenue the inquiry could pursue, the inquest at last came to its conclusion and rendered its verdict. The verdict was that Harriet Monckton had been wilfully murdered by a person or persons unknown. It was a verdict that affirmed the essential fact toward which the whole of the inquiry had pointed, that her death had been no accident and no act of her own hand, but the deliberate work of another. And it was at the same time a verdict that confessed the failure of the inquiry to go further, for it named no one. The person or persons who had murdered her remained, in the words of the finding itself, unknown. With that verdict, the formal proceedings upon the death of Harriet Monckton came to an end, and with them ended, in effect, the pursuit of her killer. There was no committal of any person for trial, for the inquest had named no one to be committed. There was no arrest, for there was no charge to found an arrest upon. The case did not pass, as many cases of the period passed, from the inquest room to the assize court, where a prisoner would be arraigned and a jury would weigh the evidence and a judge would pronounce a sentence. It ended where it had been conducted, in the coroner's court, with a finding of murder and no murderer. There was no trial in the matter of Harriet Monckton because there was no one to try. This absence of any trial is among the defining features of the case, and it marks it apart from the general run of murders of the age. The ordinary progress of a Victorian murder ran from the discovery of the body, through the inquest and the committal, to the trial at the assizes, and thence to the verdict, and in cases of conviction, to the sentence and its execution. The case of Harriet Monckton was arrested at the second of these stages and went no further. It generated a vast body of testimony and a file that would be preserved among the records of the Metropolitan Police, and it generated a verdict of murder, but it never generated a prisoner in the dock. The whole of its legal life was lived within the coroner's court, and there it died. The immediate aftermath of the verdict was, for the town and for the congregation, a settling into an uneasy and permanent uncertainty. No resolution had been reached. The persons who had fallen under suspicion were neither cleared by a trial nor condemned by one. They returned, so far as they could, to their ordinary lives, but they returned under a shadow that no verdict had lifted, for the finding of murder by a person unknown left the question of which person open to every mind in Bromley. The young man who had courted her lived on in the town and at his trade for many years afterward, and the mention of his later life is made here only to record that it fell outside the crime and cannot be read as any evidence of his part in it. The men of the chapel continued in their callings, the companion continued in hers, and the town continued to wonder. The chapel congregation, which had borne the closest weight of the affair, was left permanently altered by it. A community whose strength had lain in the mutual trust and known character of its members had been forced to contemplate that one of its own was in all probability a murderer who walked among them still, unnamed and unpunished. Such knowledge is not easily lived with, and the record indicates that the affair left its mark upon the congregation for a long time after the inquest had risen. The interest that the Home Office and the London police had taken in the matter faded, as such interest does, when the avenues of inquiry were exhausted and no new evidence came forward. The file was not closed in the sense of being resolved. It was closed in the sense of being set aside, complete in its testimony and empty of its answer. The question that the verdict had settled in law remained, for many, unsettled in fact, and it is proper to set out the terms of that question as the case itself framed them. From the first, two explanations of the death had stood in opposition. The one held that Harriet Monckton had taken her own life, driven to it by the desperate circumstance of a pregnancy that could not much longer be hidden and that promised her ruin. The other held that she had been killed, poisoned by a hand that had reason to silence her. The manner of death by prussic acid did not by itself decide between the two, for the same poison would serve either a self-destroyer or a murderer. Yet the circumstances that surrounded the death told, upon examination, against the first explanation and in favour of the second. The absence of any vessel that might have held the poison was the foremost of these circumstances, and it was never explained away. A woman who had poisoned herself in that place would have left behind the bottle or the phial from which she drank, and no such thing was found. There was, further, the place itself, the privy behind the chapel, an unlikely place for a young woman to have chosen for her own end, and a place consistent with a body having been left where it would not at once be seen. And there was the concealed pregnancy, which supplied to another person, as readily as to the deceased herself, a motive bearing upon her death. These circumstances, taken together, moved the weight of the case toward murder, and it was to murder that the inquest in the end came. It would be wrong to say that the possibility of self-destruction was never entertained, for it was raised and it was weighed, and the length of the inquest is itself evidence of the care with which the alternatives were considered, but it was weighed and found wanting. The accepted reading of the case, then and since, is that Harriet Monckton was murdered, and the formal verdict affirmed as much. The suicide theory belongs to the history of the case as a question that was asked and answered, not as a question that was left open. The openness of the case lies elsewhere, not in the manner of the death, but in the identity of the one who caused it. Harriet Monckton was buried in Bromley, in the ground of the town in which she had lived and died. She was 23 years of age at her death, and the child she had carried some 6 months died with her, unborn and unnamed, and is not to be reckoned among the subjects of this account, but only among the circumstances of her mother's death. Her burial closed the outward and bodily part of the matter. The inward part, the question of who had killed her and why, was buried with no such finality, for it had no grave and no rest, and it passed from the town's active concern only slowly and into the town's memory, and thence over the long course of years very nearly into oblivion. The world in which these events occurred was one particular to its time and place, and something of that world must be set down if the case is to be understood as its contemporaries understood it. Early Victorian Bromley was a community in which the respectability of a woman was among her most valued and most vulnerable possessions. For an unmarried woman, the appearance and the fact of chastity were the ground upon which her standing in the community rested, and the loss of them was not a private misfortune, but a public disgrace that could deprive her of her livelihood, her friends, and her place. A woman in Harriet Monckton's position, unmarried and 6 months with child, faced not merely embarrassment, but the collapse of the whole structure of her life. And this hard fact of her world is essential to the case, for it explains both the depth of her concealment and the strength of the motive that her condition supplied to any person implicated in it. The machinery of the dissenting chapel, within which so much of her life had been passed, was a machinery of mutual observation and moral discipline. Congregations of that kind maintained watch over the conduct of their members and reserved to themselves the power to admonish, to suspend, and to expel those who fell into what they held to be sin. The Sunday school in which she had taught was an institution for the moral as much as the intellectual formation of the young, and its teachers were chosen for their character. To be a teacher in such a school, and to be secretly with child, was to stand in a contradiction that could not be sustained, and the discovery of it would have ended her position at once. The chapel that had given her a place and a purpose would, upon the revealing of her condition, have become the instrument of her disgrace. This was the closed and watchful world in which she moved, and the manner of her death cannot be separated from it. There is, too, the matter of the state of criminal investigation in that period, for the case fell in the earliest years of organised detective policing and shows plainly the limits of it. The Metropolitan Police had been established but a decade and a half before, and its capacity for the detection of crime, as distinct from the keeping of order, was still rudimentary. There was as yet no settled science by which a poison might be traced to its purchaser, no register that would infallibly record the sale of a deadly substance, no method by which the movements of a suspect might be established beyond the testimony of those who had seen him. The coroner's inquest remained, in cases such as this, the principal instrument of investigation, an instrument well suited to the establishing of a cause of death, but ill suited to the naming of a secret poisoner. The failure to solve the murder of Harriet Monckton was in part a failure of the men who inquired into it, but it was in greater part a failure of the means available to any inquirer in the year 1843. The poison itself belonged to that world in a way that is worth the noting. Prussic acid, in the 1840s, was not a substance confined to the laboratory or the apothecary's most guarded shelf. It was employed in various trades and in the preparation of certain medicines, and it could be obtained by those who had occasion to use it without the barriers that a later age would raise against the sale of deadly things. Its availability meant that its presence in the hands of any number of persons was possible, and that the mere fact of a death by prussic acid pointed to no particular trade or calling as its source. This, too, was among the difficulties of the case, for a poison that many might obtain is a poison that fixes guilt upon no one. For a great span of years after the inquest had risen and the file had been set aside, the case of Harriet Monckton passed out of the general memory and became a matter of purely local recollection, and at length scarcely even that. It entered no ballad and no play, as some of the more sensational or more quickly resolved crimes of the age had done. It gave rise to no famous trial to fix it in the public mind, for it had given rise to no trial at all. A murder without a murderer, in a small Kentish town, offered the makers of popular entertainment little to work upon, for such entertainments fed upon the drama of accusation and the spectacle of the scaffold, and the case of Harriet Monckton had furnished neither. It was in consequence forgotten, as thousands of unresolved deaths of the century were forgotten, and might have remained so. That it did not remain so is owing to two things. The first is the survival of the record, the depositions taken over the long course of the inquest, and the file that the Metropolitan Police had opened upon the case were not destroyed but preserved and passed in time into the keeping of the National Archive of the country, where they remain. For a case of such obscurity, the surviving record is unusually rich, for the very length of the inquest had produced a great body of sworn testimony, set down in writing and kept. In those papers, the last evening of Harriet Monckton's life and the accounts of the persons who had surrounded her lay preserved through all the years in which the town itself forgot her, awaiting only an eye to read them. The second thing is the reading of them. In the early part of the present century, the surviving inquest depositions and the archival record were taken up by a writer and made the foundation of a book, published in the year 2018, that told the story of the case anew and drew from obscurity the name of Harriet Monckton. That book was a work of fiction, built upon the documented skeleton of the case, and it is proper to distinguish the invented from the recorded, for the imaginings of a novelist are not the findings of an inquest, and the one must not be read as the other. What the book did, and what gives it its place in the history of the case, was to carry the name and the circumstances of the death to a readership far beyond the town of Bromley, and to restore to a measure of public knowledge a case that had lain unregarded for the better part of 2 centuries. The load-bearing facts it rested upon, the date, the age, the poison, the concealed pregnancy, the marathon inquest, the verdict of murder by a person unknown, are the documented facts of the record, and they are the facts upon which this account has also relied. Alongside that revival in print, the memory of the case has been kept in a smaller way through the interest of local historians and antiquarian societies who have set down what is known of the persons connected with it and of the town as it then was. Through such labours, the dates and the trade of the young man who had courted her, and the names of the clergy connected with the chapel circle, have been established and preserved. These are modest works of local reach, but they form part of the thread by which the case has been carried down from its own time to the present, and they supplement the great archival record with the particulars that only local knowledge retains. No arrest was ever made, the investigation was formally closed, the case remains open, the record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the second case falls silent. The turn now is to the last of these 3 accounts, quieter still than the one before it, and set in a different corner of the country and a different year. It unfolded not in a village or a chapel yard, but in the heart of a great commercial city, behind a locked street door, and it turned once again upon a figure who was expected, who was admitted, and whom no inquiry could finally name. The case of Sarah Milson begins in the City of London in the spring of 1866. The city proper, the old square mile bounded by the line of the vanished Roman wall, was by that year the commercial centre of the largest city on earth, a district of counting houses, banks, warehouses, and merchant firms through which an immense daily tide of clerks, porters, and men of business flowed each morning and ebbed again each night. Cannon Street ran through the southern part of this district, a busy thoroughfare of trade that had been widened and rebuilt in the preceding decades, and along it stood the premises of firms dealing in every commodity that passed through the port of London. Among them were the premises of Bevington and Sons, leather merchants, whose warehouse rose several stories above the pavement and held the stock and business of a substantial and respectable concern. The character of the city by night differed entirely from its character by day. When the offices closed and the clerks departed westward and southward to their suburbs, the streets that had teemed with tens of thousands of men emptied almost completely, and the great buildings stood dark and shuttered, their day's business locked within. Trade did not permit these premises to be left wholly unattended. It was the settled custom of the age that warehouses and merchant houses of any size kept resident servants upon the upper floors, housekeepers and caretakers, who lived where they worked, who guarded the stock and the books through the hours of darkness, and who answered for the security of the premises when the principals of the firm had gone home. These were positions of trust, and they fell very often to women of mature years and settled respectability, widows in particular, for whom such a post offered both employment and a roof. Sarah Milson held such a position at the premises of Bevington and Sons. She was a widow of middle years, employed as housekeeper, which is to say, a live-in servant charged with the care and good order of the premises, and she lodged upon the upper floors of the warehouse itself, above the stock and the business rooms. She did not keep the house alone. A fellow servant, Elizabeth Lowes, shared the living quarters with her, and the two women passed their evenings together in the rooms above the trade, as the city around them darkened and emptied and fell quiet. The wet spring nights of that year would have found the thoroughfare below all but deserted after the counting houses closed, the traffic of the day withdrawn, and the two women the only living presence within the walls of the firm. The documented record of Sarah Milson concentrates almost wholly upon her death and the inquiry that followed it, rather than upon the years that preceded it. Of her birthplace, her parents, and the circumstances of her early life, the accessible record establishes nothing that can be stated with confidence, and where the record is silent, this account will not supply what it does not contain. What the record does establish is her situation at the time of her death. She was a widow. She was a woman of settled habits and good character, trusted by her employers with the keys and the security of a valuable commercial premises. She had reached an age at which such trust was commonly reposed, and she had held her post long enough to be a familiar and settled presence within it. Her respectability was not incidental to the case. It was central to the shock the case produced, for the crime that followed was the murder of a trusted housekeeper within the walls of a respectable city firm, yards from one of the busiest streets in London. There was, the later inquiry would suggest, a quieter history behind the settled respectability of her situation, though it must be approached with care and set down for what it was, a line of investigation and a matter of theory, rather than as established fact. It emerged, as the officers looked into her affairs, that Sarah Milson had for some time been making payments of money to a person out of her past. Some later reconstructions of the case have gone further and have held that she had married a second time after being deserted by a first husband, and that this second marriage, contracted while the first man yet lived, had left her exposed to the pressure of a person who knew of it. This background of a concealed marital history and a consequent vulnerability to extortion was treated by the inquiry as a possible explanation for the payments she had made. It was not proved, and it is not established as biographical fact. What can be said is that money had been passing from her to another, and that the inquiry came to believe there was a man from her earlier life who had reason to call upon her, and whom she had reason to admit. The manner in which she kept her post was in every outward respect ordinary. The days passed in the routine of a resident housekeeper, the care of the premises, the ordering of the small domestic economy of the rooms above the warehouse, the securing of the doors when the business of the firm was done. The evenings were passed quietly in the company of Elizabeth Lowes in the rooms upon the upper floor. It was into the midst of one such quiet and ordinary evening that the event which ended her life intruded, without warning and without any sign that the settled order of the house had been disturbed. The evening of Wednesday, the 11th of April, 1866, was wet. By about 9 o'clock the two women were upstairs together, the business of the day long finished and the street below given over to the rain and the dark. At that hour the quiet of the house was broken by a ring at the street doorbell, or, as some accounts have it, by a knock at the door below. The sound of a caller at such an hour, on such a night, was not a thing to be ignored, for the door gave upon the street, and the security of the premises was the housekeeper's charge. Sarah Milson rose to answer it. She took up a candle to light her way down the dark staircase to the door. As she went, she made a remark that would afterwards be repeated in every account of the case, and would become the single, most enduring detail attached to it. She said that she knew who it was. In some renderings, the words are given as a plain statement that she knew who would be at the door at that hour. She descended the stairs with her candle, leaving Elizabeth Lowes above, and went down to admit the caller she believed she recognised. She did not return. For some time the fellow servant remained upstairs and thought nothing amiss. A caller admitted at the street door, a conversation at the foot of the stairs, the ordinary business of a house that received visitors. None of this was cause for alarm. But the minutes lengthened, and Sarah Milson did not come back up to the rooms above, and no sound of her return reached the upper floor. When something near an hour had passed and the housekeeper had neither come back nor called out, Elizabeth Lowes at last went down the dark staircase herself to see what had become of her companion. What she found was at the foot of the stairs. Sarah Milson lay there, and she was dead. The candle she had carried down was out. The street door that she had gone to open, and must herself have opened to admit the caller she said she knew, was found closed again. There was no sign that the door had been forced, no mark of a break-in, nothing to indicate that entry had been won against the will of the woman who kept the house. Whoever had stood at the door that night had been admitted by the housekeeper herself, and had gone again, and had drawn the door closed behind him. Sarah Milson had been fatally beaten about the head at the foot of her own stairs. The alarm was raised, and the machinery of the law was set in motion within the hour. The premises lay within the City of London, and the crime accordingly fell to the City of London Police, the separate force that policed the square mile and answered to its own authorities rather than to the Metropolitan Police of the surrounding capital. Officers were dispatched to the premises of Bevington and Sons that night, and the investigation was formally opened. The body was examined where it lay, the position of it at the foot of the stairs noted, the state of the door and the extinguished candle recorded, and the account of Elizabeth Lowes, the only other person within the walls, taken down. From the first, the character of the crime pointed the inquiry in a particular direction. There had been no forced entry. The housekeeper had gone down to the door of her own accord, had spoken of knowing who her caller was, and had opened the door to him. Whatever had occurred at the foot of the stairs had occurred after she had admitted a person she believed she recognised, and that person had departed and closed the door behind him. The officers were confronted, therefore, not with the marks of a stranger breaking in, but with the far more troubling suggestion of a caller who was known, expected, and let in by the victim's own hand. The question that governed the whole of the inquiry was the question of who that caller had been. Robbery offered no ready answer. It was not clear that anything of value had been taken from the premises, and the crime could not be satisfactorily explained as a theft that had ended in violence. The great stock of the leather merchants lay undisturbed, the business rooms unransacked, and whatever the caller had come for, it did not appear to have been the plunder of the warehouse. This deepened rather than relieved the difficulty, for it stripped away the commonest of motives and left the officers with a killing that seemed to have been directed at the woman herself by a person she had reason to know. The investigation proceeded upon the ground that had been established on the night itself. Statements were taken from Elizabeth Lowes, who had been the only other person within the walls, and her account of the evening was set down in full. She described the quiet of the hours before 10 o'clock, the ringing of the bell, the housekeeper rising with her candle, the remark that she knew who the caller was, and the long interval of silence that followed. She described going down at last and finding her companion at the foot of the stairs. Her account placed the crime within a narrow compass of time and fixed the essential facts of it, that Sarah Milson had gone down living to answer a caller she named as known, and had been found dead within the hour, the door closed and the candle out. The officers turned their attention to the affairs of the dead woman, and it was here that the quieter history behind her situation came into view. The payments she had been making were traced, and the inquiry came to the belief that there was a man from her past who had been receiving money from her. The nature of the connection was understood to reach back to an old matter between them, described in the contemporary account as an old loan, and the officers formed the view that this man had reason to call upon her and that she had reason to admit him. The absence of forced entry, the remark that she knew her caller, and the discovery of the payments together directed the inquiry toward a single figure out of her earlier life. In the course of these inquiries, a witness came forward. This person claimed to have seen a particular man in the vicinity of the Cannon Street premises on the evening of the 11th of April, and identified him as the man who had been present at the scene. Upon this identification, the inquiry fixed. The man named was arrested and taken into custody, and the case against him was assembled and brought before the magistrates for examination. His name was William Smith. He was described in the contemporary press as a journeyman hatter of Eton, which is to say a hired tradesman who made hats, and he was a man with a history of petty offences behind him. He was understood to be the person who had been receiving money from Sarah Milson in connection with the old loan, and it was this connection, together with the identification, that formed the substance of the case against him. The evidence gathered against William Smith rested very largely upon the word of the witness who had come forward. The physical evidence connecting any particular man to the crime was thin. There was no forced entry to be traced to him, no plunder to be recovered from him, no mark upon the scene that spoke a name. What the prosecution possessed was the identification placing him at Cannon Street that evening, and the connection of money and the old loan that supplied a motive. Upon these two things, the sighting and the motive, the case was built, and upon these two things it would stand or fall when it came before a jury. The officers, having secured their man and their witness, committed the matter to the ordinary course of the law. A medical examination of the body was conducted in the manner the law required. The examining surgeon, whose duty it was to view the remains, determined that death had been caused by severe injuries to the head, inflicted at the foot of the stairs, and that these injuries had been rapidly fatal. The loss of blood at the scene had been considerable. The findings established beyond question that Sarah Milson had met a violent death by the hand of another, and that she had died where she was found. At the foot of the staircase she had descended with her candle. The name of the surgeon who conducted the examination is not fixed in the accessible record, and it will not be supplied here. What the examination established was the cause and the manner of death, and it was upon this medical foundation that the coroner's inquiry proceeded. A coroner's inquest was convened into the death of Sarah Milson, the public hearing that the law required upon any sudden or violent death held before the coroner for the city jurisdiction, and a jury summoned for the purpose. The inquest received the medical evidence as to the cause of death. It received the account of Elizabeth Lowes as to the events of the evening. It heard the facts of the discovery, the state of the door, the extinguished candle, and the position of the body at the foot of the stairs. The jury, having heard the evidence laid before them, returned a verdict of wilful murder, the formal finding that Sarah Milson had been unlawfully and deliberately killed. The verdict fixed the character of the death-in-law and set the machinery of prosecution in motion. The precise date of the inquest and the name of the coroner who presided are not established in the accessible record, and they are not stated here. Upon the finding of wilful murder, and with William Smith already in custody and charged, the matter came before the magistrates for committal, the process by which a case is sent up for trial at a higher court. The magistrates heard the evidence of the identification and the connection of the payments, and finding a case fit to be answered, committed William Smith to take his trial at the Central Criminal Court, the court known as the Old Bailey, which sat within the city for the trial of the graver offences. He was remanded to await the sitting of that court, and the case passed out of the hands of the police and the magistrates, and into the hands of the counsel who would try it. The trial of William Smith for the willful murder of Sarah Milson commenced at the Central Criminal Court in the weeks that followed the April murder. He was arraigned upon the charge of willful murder, and he pleaded not guilty. The proceedings drew the attention of the city press, for the murder of a trusted housekeeper within the walls of a respectable firm upon one of the great commercial streets of London was a matter of considerable public interest, and the question of who had stood at the door that night was one that the whole of the city had followed. The case for the prosecution was laid before the jury in the order in which it had been assembled. The circumstances of the death were established: the wet evening, the ring at the bell, the housekeeper's descent with her candle, her remark that she knew the caller, and her discovery at the foot of the stairs. The absence of forced entry was pressed, and the inference drawn that the woman had admitted a person she knew. The connection of the payments and the old loan was laid before the court as the motive, the suggestion being that the prisoner had reason to call upon Sarah Milson and that money had passed between them. And upon this foundation, the prosecution set its principal evidence, the testimony of the witness who had come forward to place William Smith at the Cannon Street premises on the night of the 11th of April. The whole weight of the case rested upon that identification, for without it there was nothing to fix the crime upon the man in the dock. The defence met the case at its single point of strength and broke it there. Counsel for the prisoner brought forward evidence of an alibi, an account of the prisoner's movements upon the evening of the murder that placed him elsewhere, and made it impossible that he could have been the caller at Cannon Street. The alibi was not a weak or a doubtful thing to be weighed against the identification and set aside. It was, by the contemporary report of the proceedings, an alibi so strong and so completely established that it left no room for the prosecution's witness to be right. Against a demonstrated account of the prisoner's whereabouts, the sighting that had been the whole of the case collapsed. The identification, which had seemed to fix the crime upon a named man, was shown to be mistaken. The strength of the alibi was such that the ordinary course of a trial was cut short. The jury did not require the long deliberation that a doubtful case demands. By the contemporary account of the proceedings, they returned their verdict without retiring from the box at all. So plain had the matter become once the alibi was heard. The verdict was not guilty. William Smith was acquitted of the murder of Sarah Milson. The acquittal was accompanied by a further step that lifted the case out of the ordinary run of failed prosecutions and fixed it in the memory of those who followed the courts. The judge who had tried the case was not content to let the prisoner go with the bare verdict of not guilty, which in the common understanding leaves a shadow of unproven suspicion behind it. He declared from the bench that William Smith was not only acquitted but innocent. It was an unusual thing for a judge to say, a positive affirmation of innocence, going beyond the mere failure of the prosecution to prove its case, and it marked the completeness with which the identification had been overthrown. The prisoner left the court not as a man against whom the case had failed, but as a man whom the court had declared to be no party to the crime. The contemporary press took note of the case as an instance of a particular danger. The Spectator, in its account of the 16th of June, 1866, treated the matter of William Smith, the journeyman hatter of Eton, as a striking example of the peril of circumstantial and identification evidence, of the ease with which an honest witness might place an innocent man at the scene of a crime he had no part in, and of the nearness with which the law had come to convicting a man whom the same law had then declared innocent. The lesson drawn was the fragility of the eyewitness identification upon which so many prosecutions of the age were built, in a period before the surer methods of later years, when the word of a witness who claimed to have seen a face was among the strongest evidence a court could hear. With the acquittal of William Smith, and with the court's declaration of his innocence, the prosecution of the murder of Sarah Milson was at an end, and no other man was put in his place. There was no sentence to be passed, no punishment to be carried out, for the one person who had been brought to the bar had been cleared and freed. He left the court an innocent man and passed out of the record of the case, and his later life is not documented in the accessible account and forms no part of the story of the crime. What the acquittal left behind was not a resolution, but a vacancy. The identification that had named a man had been shown to be mistaken, and with it went the only name the inquiry had ever produced. The caller who had stood at the street door on the wet night of the 11th of April, whom Sarah Milson had said she knew, and whom she had gone down with her candle to admit, remained unnamed. The investigation, having spent its single suspect, had nowhere further to go. The physical evidence had been thin from the first, resting upon the fact of a killing without forced entry and without any clear theft to explain it. The circumstantial case had been built upon the payments and the old loan and the word of a witness, and when the witness was overthrown, the structure had nothing left to stand upon. The officers of the City of London Police had traced the affairs of the dead woman, had found the man from her past, had secured an identification and brought a prosecution, and had seen the prosecution fail completely at trial. Beyond the man they had charged, the record does not show that the inquiry was able to name another. The case was left where the acquittal had put it, without a suspect and without a solution. The circumstances that had governed the inquiry from the beginning governed it still at the end, and made the vacancy the more difficult to fill. The whole character of the crime pointed to a person known to the victim. There had been no break-in. Sarah Milson had admitted her caller by her own hand, had spoken of knowing who he was, and had drawn no alarm as she went down to him. The door had been found closed again after him, as though he had left in the ordinary way of a visitor whose visit was expected. Every feature of the scene spoke of a familiar figure, admitted without fear and departing without haste, and yet the one familiar figure the inquiry had produced had been proved to be elsewhere. The person who fitted the circumstances of the crime had never been identified, and the person who had been identified had not fitted the circumstances. What, if anything, had been taken from the premises was never satisfactorily settled. The great stock of the leather merchants remained, the business rooms were not ransacked, and robbery had never offered a clean account of the killing. If the caller had come for money, for the payments that had been passing, or for some matter connected with the old history between them, that was a thing the inquiry could suppose but could not prove, and the supposition died with the collapse of the case against the only man charged. The motive, like the man, remained a matter of inference. The killing had the appearance of a thing directed at Sarah Milson herself, by someone with a reason to seek her out, and the reason, like the name, was never fixed. The case entered the records of the city and the archives of the law, and there it remained. The proceedings of the Central Criminal Court preserved the trial and the acquittal. The case papers were kept among the records of the state, and a file upon the murder of Mrs. Sarah Milson at Cannon Street survives among them to the present. The city press of 1866 had followed the matter closely, from the discovery of the body through the arrest and committal to the trial, and the judge's declaration of innocence, and its columns preserved the detail of the case for those who should afterwards look for it. A crime broadside was printed and sold upon the streets, of the kind that the age produced upon any notable murder, setting out the mysterious murder in Cannon Street, and the examination of the supposed murderer, and a copy of it survives in a collection of such broadsides held abroad. Between the court record, the state papers, the newspapers, and the broadside, the documentary trace of the case is full. The name of the killer is the one thing the documents do not contain. The murder took its place among the crimes of the mid-Victorian city, and it is against the particular character of that place and that time that it is best understood. The City of London in 1866 was a district that emptied at night, its daytime population of clerks and merchants and porters withdrawing to their homes and leaving the great commercial buildings in the keeping of the resident servants who lived within them. The vulnerability of these live-in servants was a settled feature of the arrangement. a housekeeper alone, or nearly alone, upon the upper floors of a warehouse, with the keys to a valuable premises and the charge of its security through the dark hours, stood in a position of trust that was also a position of exposure. She answered the door because it was her duty to answer it, and in answering it she admitted whoever stood upon the other side. The crime that ended Sarah Milson's life was a crime that the conditions of her employment made possible: a caller at a night door and a servant whose office it was to open to him. The reliance of the age upon eyewitness identification stood at the centre of what the case came to represent. In a period before the surer methods of a later time, the courts leaned heavily upon the word of witnesses who claimed to have seen a face and could name the man to whom it belonged. Such evidence was among the strongest that a prosecution could bring, and juries gave it great weight. The case of William Smith showed how far that reliance could carry a prosecution toward the conviction of the wrong man, and how near an honest but mistaken identification could bring an innocent person to the gravest jeopardy the law could impose. It was for this reason that the contemporary press seized upon the case, not for the mystery of the unsolved killing, but for the lesson of the man who had been placed at the scene by a witness and saved from that scene only by the strength of his account of being elsewhere. The background against which the crime was set had, too, its own quiet significance. The payments that Sarah Milson had been making and the history from her past that the inquiry believed lay behind them spoke to a circumstance of the age in which a woman's concealed marital history might be turned into a means of pressure upon her. A first husband who had deserted her, a second marriage contracted in his continued life, a secret that could be held over her by a person who knew of it. These were the materials from which extortion could be made, and the inquiry came to believe that such materials had existed in her case. It is set down here as the inquiry treated it, as a line of theory and a possible explanation for the money that had passed, and not as a proven fact of her life. The record establishes the payments. It does not establish, with the certainty that would permit it to be stated as fact, the marriage or the secret that was supposed to lie behind them. The case never rose to the rank of a celebrated crime. It produced no enduring work of literature, no song, no play, no lasting fame of the kind that fixed certain other Victorian murders permanently in the public mind. It was heavily reported in its own moment, and then overtaken by the endless succession of other cases, and it slipped, over the decades, out of the general memory. Where it survived in the compilations of London's forgotten and unsolved crimes, in the pages of writers who gathered up the lost cases of the city's past, and in the great surveys of London's history that touched upon the darker episodes of its streets. It was remembered, where remembered at all, as a classic mystery of a particular kind, the killing of a trusted servant behind a door she had opened herself, in a building at the heart of the greatest commercial city of the age, yards from a thoroughfare that never emptied of traffic by day and stood deserted by night. The shape of the case, when it is set down plainly, is the shape of a domestic mystery worked out within the walls of a place of business, a housekeeper who kept a warehouse, a fellow servant who shared her rooms, a wet April night, and the two women upstairs by their fire, while the city lay dark and empty around them. A ring at the street doorbell at 9 o'clock, and the housekeeper rising with her candle, saying that she knew who it would be. A dark staircase descended, a door opened to an expected caller, and then silence for something near an hour, until the fellow servant went down and found her at the foot of the stairs, the candle out and the door closed again upon whoever had come and gone. Every element of the scene is documented. The one element the documents withhold is the face of the person who stood at the door. The vulnerability the case exposed was not peculiar to Sarah Milson. It belonged to a whole class of women who kept the premises of the city through its dark hours. Widows and servants of settled years, in positions of trust, who lived where they worked and guarded what they could not own, and who answered the door at night because that was the office they held. Their situation gave them a roof and a livelihood, and it placed them alone or nearly alone between the street and the stock of a valuable house. The night door was the point at which that situation turned, the place where the duty to admit and the danger of admitting met, and it was at the night door that Sarah Milson's life was ended. The identification of the killer was never made, and none was ever established in place of the one that had failed. The man who had been tried had been declared innocent, and the law, having emptied its single suspicion into a prosecution that collapsed, did not fill it again. The City of London police had done what the methods of the age allowed, and the methods of the age had not been equal to a crime that left no forced entry, no certain theft, and no trace of the caller but the victim's own words that she knew him. The record of the case is full in every part, but the one that mattered most, and that part it leaves blank. The premises where these events unfolded stood in that part of Cannon Street that ran through the southern reach of the square mile, close to the river and to the great markets and wharves that fed the trade of the port. The street itself had been widened and driven through in the improvements of earlier decades, cut across the old tangle of lanes to make a broad and modern thoroughfare, and along it the traffic of goods and men ran unceasingly through the working day. The warehouses that lined it were tall and plain, built for the storage of stock rather than for show, their upper floors given over to goods, and their lower floors to the counting rooms and the business of the firms that owned them. The house of Bevington and Sons was one such building, a leather merchant's premises of several stories, and it was upon its upper floors, above the stock and the trade, that its resident servants kept their rooms and passed their nights. The trade of the leather merchant was among the oldest and steadiest of the city's commerce, drawing upon the tanneries and the markets, and supplying the countless workshops that turned hide into the goods of daily use. A firm of any standing in that trade held a considerable stock upon its premises, and the value of that stock was the reason a resident servant was kept to guard it. The keys of such a house were a serious charge. They opened the doors that stood between the street and a warehouse full of goods, and the person who held them held the security of the whole. It was a charge commonly given to a woman of settled years and proven honesty, and the giving of it was a mark of the trust the firm reposed in her. Sarah Milson had held that charge, and had held it long enough to be a fixed and familiar presence within the house. The manner of life of such a resident servant was quiet and enclosed. The day brought the noise and movement of the trade, the clerks and the porters, and the business of the firm filling the lower floors, and through those hours the housekeeper's office was the ordering of the domestic economy of the upper rooms and the general oversight of the premises. The evening brought a great change. As the counting rooms closed and the men of the firm departed, the noise drained out of the building and out of the street, and the house that had been full through the day stood by nightfall all but empty. The resident servants remained. They were the living presence left within the walls when the trade had gone home, and their evenings were passed in the small compass of the upper rooms, in the light of a fire and a candle, while the great dark building stood silent below them, and the street outside gave up its traffic to the night. It was into that silence that a caller at 9 o'clock came as an event. The city by night was not a place of movement. The thoroughfares that had carried tens of thousands of men by day were given over, after the offices closed, to the rain and the lamplight, and the occasional passage of a policeman upon his beat. A ring at a street door bell at that hour, in such a place, was a thing that carried its own weight, for it was not the hour at which the business of the firm brought callers, and whoever stood at the door at 9 o'clock on a wet night stood there upon some private errand of his own. The housekeeper who answered such a ring answered it alone, with a candle, down a staircase that the departed trade had left in darkness, and she opened the door upon whatever the night had brought to it. The City of London police, into whose hands the crime fell, was the force peculiar to the square mile, distinct from the larger metropolitan force that policed the surrounding capital and answering to the ancient authorities of the city itself. Its men kept the beats of the commercial district through the empty nights, watching the shuttered warehouses and the deserted streets, and it was to this force that the murder within the walls of Bevington and Sons belonged. Its officers conducted the whole of the inquiry, from the first attendance at the premises on the night of the discovery through the tracing of the dead woman's affairs and the securing of the man who was charged. The failure that followed at the trial was not a failure of diligence in the pursuit of the one suspect the inquiry produced. It was the failure of the evidence itself, the collapse of an identification that had seemed to name the killer and proved instead to name a man who had been elsewhere. The broadsides that were printed and sold upon the case belonged to a form of street literature that the age produced upon any notable crime. These were single sheets, hawked through the streets by sellers who cried the horror of the day, setting out in plain and hurried print the facts of a murder, the examination of a suspect, and often a rough woodcut and a set of verses to fasten the matter in the public mind. The broadside upon the Cannon Street murder followed that pattern, giving out the mystery of the killing and the examination of the supposed murderer to the crowds who bought such sheets by the penny. It was ephemeral literature, printed for the moment and not for the archive, and it is a matter of some chance that a copy survived to be gathered into a collection and preserved. Its survival, alongside the graver records of the court and the state, completes the documentary trace, the case left behind, and marks the degree of public interest the crime commanded in its own hour. The kind of mystery the case represented was a kind that age understood well, and the later record has continued to recognise. It was the mystery of a killing worked out not in the open street, where a stranger might strike and vanish into a crowd, but within the enclosure of a private house, behind a door that the victim herself had opened. Such crimes carried a particular disquiet, for they turned upon trust rather than upon force. The stranger who breaks in is an intruder against whom the house may be defended. The caller who is admitted is a guest, let in by the very person he has come to harm, and against him the ordinary defences of a house are useless, for they have been set aside by the hand that opened the door. The murder of Sarah Milson belonged to this second and more troubling kind. She had not been overpowered from without. She had gone down of her own will to admit a person she believed she knew. The remark she made, as she went, that she knew who her caller was the single fact that fixed the crime in this character, and that no amount of inquiry could ever fully open. It was heard by the one other person in the house, and it was set down and repeated in every account of the case thereafter. It established, more surely than any other piece of evidence, that the person at the door was not a stranger to her. She named no name that survived. She said only that she knew, and she went down, and the knowledge she carried with her to the door was lost with her at the foot of the stairs. The inquiry could suppose from that remark a familiar figure out of her past, could trace the payments and find the man who received them, could bring that man to trial, and could see the case against him fall. What it could not do was recover the knowledge she'd carried down the stairs, the certainty in her own voice that she knew who waited on the other side of the door. The nearness of the crime to the ordinary life of the great city gave it much of its power to unsettle. The premises stood upon a thoroughfare that by day was among the busiest in London, thronged with the traffic of a world of commerce, and the killing had been done within its walls, while that world lay only yards away, emptied for the night and oblivious. There was no distance in it, no remote and lonely place to which the imagination could consign the danger. It had happened in the heart of the city, in a respectable house of business, to a woman of good character, in a position of trust, and it had happened because she had done no more than answer her own door at night. which was the very office she was kept to perform. The comfort of the familiar and the respectable was the thing the case disturbed, for it showed that neither the respectability of the house nor the trust reposed in the servant had been any protection at all. The judicial declaration that had cleared William Smith gave the case a second character alongside the mystery of the unsolved killing, and it was for this second character, as much as for the first, that the case was afterwards remembered where it was remembered at all. The bare acquittal of a prisoner was a common enough end to a prosecution, and it left, in the ordinary understanding, a residue of unproven suspicion about the man who had stood in the dock. The declaration from the bench that the prisoner was not only acquitted but innocent went beyond that ordinary end and lifted the man clear of the suspicion altogether. It was a rare thing for a judge to say, and it was said because the evidence of the prisoner's innocence had been so complete that the failure of the prosecution amounted to a positive proof that he had had no part in the crime. The case thus stood as an instance of the law drawing back at the very edge of a wrongful conviction and setting the record straight upon the one man it had wrongly named. That the law could go so near to convicting an innocent man upon the honest word of a mistaken witness and be saved from it only by the accident of a well-established alibi was the lesson the case carried into the memory of those who studied the courts. Had William Smith been a man who could not account for his movements upon the evening of the 11th of April, the identification that named him might have stood, and the gravest sentence the law could pass might have followed upon it. It was not the strength of the case against him that saved him, for the case against him had seemed strong enough to bring him to trial. It was the strength of his answer to it. The margin between the innocent man freed and the innocent man condemned was, in his case, the margin of an alibi, and the case was preserved in the record as a warning of how narrow that margin could be. The evidence upon which a capital prosecution of that period could be built was of necessity the evidence that the methods of the period could gather, and those methods were narrow by the measure of a later age. There was no means of fixing a man to a scene by any trace he might have left upon it, no certain science of identity to set against the fallible memory of a witness. What the courts had was testimony, the account of persons who had seen or heard, and the inferences that could be drawn from the circumstances of a crime. Where a killing left no forced entry, no recovered plunder, and no living witness to the act itself, the whole of a prosecution came to rest upon the word of those who could place a man near the scene, and upon the motive that could be shown to have moved him. It was a structure that could be strong in appearance and weak in fact, and the case of the Cannon Street murder was the plainest demonstration of that weakness, for it had seemed strong enough to bring a man to trial, and had proved upon the hearing to name the wrong man entirely. The fellow servant who had shared the rooms above the warehouse carried after that night a particular weight within the case, for she was the only living person who could speak to what had passed within the house. It was her account that fixed the hour of the ring at the bell, the housekeeper's rising, the words she spoke as she took up her candle, and the long silence that followed. It was she who had gone down at last and made the discovery at the foot of the stairs. Upon her testimony, the coroner's jury and the court alike depended for their knowledge of the evening, for beyond her there was no one who had been within the walls to tell of it. The record establishes her part in the events and the substance of what she told. It does not follow her beyond the case, and her later life forms no part of the account that survives. The House of Bevington and Sons continued in its trade after the crime, as a firm of standing continued through the passing of any single misfortune, and the premises upon Cannon Street returned to the ordinary business of the leather merchant. The murder had been an event within the walls, not a ruin of the concern, and the daily tide of the trade resumed over the place where it had happened. What lingered was not any interruption of the business, but the memory of the night, the knowledge that a trusted servant had been killed at the foot of the stairs within the house, and the unanswered question of who had stood at the door. The premises kept their function. The case kept its silence. In the great surveys of London's history that came afterwards, the case found a place among the darker episodes of the city's past. The killing was taken up in the account a modern writer gave of the city's long life, set among the crimes and horrors that the streets had witnessed across the centuries, and there the essential shape of it was preserved. The housekeeper and the candle, the caller she said she knew, the fellow servant and the discovery, and the shadowed history of payments and an old connection that the inquiry had traced behind the crime. It was gathered, too, into the compilations that collected the unsolved and forgotten murders of women in the London of that century, the volumes that sought out the cases the general memory had let fall and set them down together. Through these the case survived, not as a famous crime that every reader knew, but as a documented one that the curious might find, its record intact and its question open. The question that the record leaves open is a narrow and a precise one, and the fullness of the surviving documents throws it into a sharper relief. Almost everything about the case is known. The date is fixed, the place is fixed, the victim is known, her situation is known, the manner of her death is established, the fellow servant's account is preserved, the arrest and the trial and the acquittal are recorded, and the judge's declaration of the prisoner's innocence stands upon the record of the court. The broadside, the newspaper columns, the state papers and the proceedings of the Old Bailey together preserve the case in a detail that many a better-known crime cannot match. And out of all that fullness, the one thing missing is the name of the person who came to the door. The documents are complete, but for the single fact they exist to establish. The situation of the victim, a widowed housekeeper in a position of trust, keeping the premises of a city firm through the empty hours of the night, belonged to a whole quiet class of women whose lives left little other trace upon the record. They did not own the houses they guarded, nor did they command the trade that filled them by day. They kept the keys, ordered the small domestic affairs of the upper rooms, and answered for the security of a valuable property through the hours when its owners were gone. It was an office of trust and an office of solitude, and it placed a woman, night after night, as the sole guardian of a house she did not own, at the point where the street met the door. The record of such women is, for the most part, a silence, their lives passing unremarked in the ordinary keeping of other men's premises. It is only through the violence that ended it that the life of Sarah Milson enters the record at all, and even there it enters chiefly at its close, in the account of the night she went down to the door and did not return. The concealed history that the inquiry believed lay behind the payments belonged likewise to a circumstance the age knew well, in which a matter kept secret out of a woman's earlier life could be turned against her by a person who held the knowledge of it. A marriage deserted, a second union formed in the continued life of the first husband, a secret that could not be spoken without ruin. These were the materials from which a hold might be taken over a person, and the money that could be drawn from them the price of the silence. The inquiry supposed such a hold in the case of Sarah Milson, and traced in the payments she had made the working of it. Whether the supposition was true in every part the record does not establish, and it is set down, as the inquiry held it, a theory of the case and a probable account of the money, and not a proven passage of her life. What the record fixes is the fact of the payments and the belief of the officers that a man from her past had been receiving them. The rest is inference, and the inference died unproven with the collapse of the case at trial. The murder passed in the end into that class of crimes which are fully recorded and never solved, where the failure lies not in the keeping of the record, but in the reach of the inquiry. The papers survive, the answer does not. It is a class of case that carries its own particular disquiet, for it offers the appearance of completeness, a full file, a documented trial, a preserved account, and withholds, at the centre, the one thing that would make the completeness real. The reader of such a file may follow every step, may know the hour and the place and the manner of the death, may read the words the victim spoke and the verdict the court returned, and may reach the end of it no nearer to the name than the officers were on the night they first came to the premises. The case of the Cannon Street murder is such a file, complete in its documentation and empty at its heart. The judge's words upon the acquittal remained the most singular thing the case produced, and they fixed its place in the memory of the courts more surely than the mystery of the killing did. To declare a prisoner not only acquitted but innocent was to go beyond the office of the verdict, which speaks only to whether a charge is proved, and to speak to the fact of the matter, which is that the man had no part in the crime. It was said because the evidence permitted it to be said, because the answer the defence had made was so complete that no doubt of the prisoner's innocence could honestly remain. And it stood upon the record as a rare instance of the law affirming, in the clearest terms it could use, that the man it had brought within reach of the gallows was guiltless. The affirmation cleared one name, it did not supply another. The law had spoken with certainty upon the innocence of the man it had wrongly accused, and could say nothing at all upon the guilt of the man it had never found. So the two things stood together at the end of the case, and stand together still in the record it left behind. On the one hand, a man declared innocent by the court that tried him, lifted clear of the suspicion that a bare acquittal would have left upon him, and sent out of the dock as guiltless of the crime. On the other, a killing unaccounted for, a caller unnamed, a woman dead at the foot of her own stairs behind a door she had opened to a person she said she knew. The one certainty the case achieved was a certainty of innocence. The one question it could not answer was the question of guilt. Between the innocent man cleared and the guilty man never found, the record of the Cannon Street murder came to its rest, full in every part but the part that mattered, and open at the single point it had been opened to close. The case of Sarah Milson was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. The law freed an innocent man and never found a guilty one. The case file was closed without resolution. No suspect was charged. The record remained as it stood.